Good evening. It is great to welcome so many people here this evening to our next installment, our latest installment of the Library Company of Philadelphia's virtual lectures. We're so happy to share some time with you this evening. My name is Amy Sobczak-Joseph, and I am the director of the Davida Tenenbaum Deutsch program in women's history at the Library Company. I am also assistant professor of history at Wilkes University. We always like to take some time at the beginning of these programs to introduce new folks and remind old friends about our institutional history. The Library Company of Philadelphia was founded in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin as a subscription library supported by its shareholders. In the present day, the Library Company is an independent research library concentrating on American society and culture from the 17th through the 19th centuries. We are free and open to the public, but what can you find there? The Library Company houses an extensive non-circulating collection of rare books, manuscripts, broadsides, ephemera, prints, photographs, and works of art. Our mission is to foster scholarship in and increase public understanding of American history before 1900 by preserving and interpreting the valuable materials in our care. The Library Company connects with thousands of visitors annually, whether in person or online, first-time visitors, or longtime friends. A tradition of active participation by shareholders and members continues well into the 21st century. And so if you enjoy this event about the past, you could help to shape the Library Company's future through your own financial support. Our program tonight is generously supported by one of those supporters that I've been talking about. The Davida Tenenbaum Deutsch program in women's history provides funding for a variety of activities at the Library Company, and we're pleased to offer yet another event this year. As a research library, the Library Company welcomes scholars from across the country and around the world to use the collections. And we're quite proud to use some of the financial support that we receive to provide fellowships to some of these researchers. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Shana Klein, is the 2023-2024 Davida Tenenbaum Deutsch Program in Women's History Short-Term Fellow. She spent some time in the reading room back in the fall, and we are so pleased to have her back to share some of her new work with us tonight. Dr. Klein is an assistant professor of art history at Kent State University. She is the author of The Fruits of Empire: Art, Food, and the Politics of Race in the Age of American Expansion, which was published by the University of California Press back in 2020. If that title is not enticing enough, I do want to explain that her book explores visual images of the grape, orange, watermelon, banana, and pineapple, and how those were incorporated into broader political debates in the late 19th century. But tonight, Dr. Klein's lecture is titled Bound and Boarded: Representations of Native Motherhood in U.S. Art and Culture. She will talk tonight for about roughly 40 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions for a little bit afterwards. As you might have noticed, this seminar is in Zoom webinar format. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A function, which is found along the bottom menu of your screen, to submit your questions. You can feel free to submit those as the program goes on, and then I will pose those after Dr. Klein finishes her talk. I had the opportunity to hear about her work a few months ago, and I hope that you will find it as exciting and intriguing as I do. So let's please welcome Dr. Shana Klein to our screens.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. And let me first express my gratitude and extend it to Amy Sobczak-Joseph and Allison Kronstadt for giving me this opportunity and also for helping me execute it. I'm hoping this looks okay, my screen. The title of my talk has changed a little bit, but it still kind of gets at the essence of what I'm thinking about: bound and boarded, policing or representations of Native motherhood in US art and culture. I have timed my talk to be about 35 to 40 minutes, so I hope I can keep true to that. And it's essentially a talk on Native motherhood in American art and culture. So let's dig in. In the right-hand corner of the celebrated painting by Benjamin West, Penn's Treaty with the Indians, a woman looks downward and fixes her gaze on a baby as she angles her breast to feed the child milk. I think she's hard to miss. She's placed in the foreground closest to the viewer's vantage point. Yet in West's painting, where every detail has been mined by scholars, from the symbolism of the elm tree to the Lenape men in the center, it's surprising that few scholars have investigated the Native woman breastfeeding an infant on a cradleboard. This is a trope that I call the Native Madonna, and I think she warrants more investigation since she was shown repeatedly and by some of the most famous US painters. The Native Madonna archetype carried a heavy load in art, mainly helping to sanitize scenes of land theft and violence against Native people. But I'll show you towards the end of my talk that not all painters followed suit. Some depictions of Native women and children in the later paintings of artist Charles Knoll, they show mothering women who did not express an ease in conquest or assimilation. Later in the 19th century, though, the US government installed the Field Matron Program, which set out to specifically assimilate Native women to models of US motherhood. This paper considers how artists supported or resisted initiatives that targeted Native women in attempts to control Native land and people. Returning to West's painting of a treaty signing, the breastfeeding woman looks unruffled by the action in the middle ground, and she, I think, is a testament to the peaceful approach of Quaker leader William Penn, who's represented right here in a brown suit and black hat in the center. Many of you might be very familiar with this painting already, but he's gesturing to Native people in the composition. Not even the baby stirs in the corner of the painting, sweetening the scene, which memorialized the signing of one of the longest nonviolent treaties between colonial settlers and Native Americans. But even in nonviolent circumstances, treaties forced Native people to surrender vast amounts of land, to migrate and stop practicing ways of life through political coercion and intimidation. This intimate moment right here between a woman and child pictured by West, a moment, notice that it's so explicitly nonviolent, sanitizes the history of Native land theft that characterized even the most benevolent of treaties. West's painting of Quakers offering cloth annuities in exchange for Native land further represent the described benevolence of colonial settlers. Native people in the painting eagerly await the treaty signing and the exchange of manufactured cloth, and cloth was one of the most popular trading goods of the time. West displayed how women in particular participated in this trade, since the breastfeeding figure wears a coat that resembles a European imported wool and in a shade of blue that was likely an imported dye. The woman also wears a striped headband that's not Lenape in style, in my understanding. It looks more European, maybe even Orientalist in fashion. West's painting makes Native assimilation into Euro-American culture look possible as well as fashionable. West further brings together the Lenape woman with European culture by painting her according to classical portraits of Madonna and child. Both women share the same bowed posture, downturned gaze, and famously blue cloak. The swaddled baby in West's painting may have also conjured an image of Christ, whose swaddling clothes were described in the New Testament as cloth tied together by bandage-like strips. The classicization of this Lenape woman and her insertion into the visual language of Christian motherhood might have displayed to West viewers the potential for Native women to assimilate and absorb Christian ideals. The divine connotations of West's breastfeeding figure may have also supported European fantasies of America as this biblical land of milk and honey. This region was described as a godly paradise, supplying endless resources for the taking. And we can see this in maps and folios. This dates to a much earlier time period in the 16th and 17th centuries, but Here, Native women and children, they served as allegorical figures of America, and by extension, the fertile American landscape. German printer Theodore de Bry famously printed watercolors of Virginia Native people in a folio about the Americas, and he shows two views of a woman with this infant clinging to her back. In the background landscape, you can see plants blooming, trees growing in orderly rows. This image of a fertile landscape is accentuated by the depiction of a Native woman and child who doubly signal fertility. It advertised the rich resources of the New World to European viewers. The display of fertile and bare-breasted women in the landscape, however, also requires a deeper investigation into the context of sexual violence. In the long history of sexual violations against Native women by European colonizers, portrayals of Native women's bodies on display might signal that they too are ripe for the taking, and not just the land alone. But I also want to think about this image and West painting in another way. Thought of another way, images like de Bry's and West, they represent Native women as belonging to a procreative and generative culture. This runs contrary to how many scholars in my discipline talk about the trope of the vanishing, doomed Indian. And while this trope is certainly pervasive, especially in paintings by West, I'm showing you one of his most famous examples. This is his painting, The Death of General Wolfe. And he shows this Native warrior sorrowfully resting his chin on his hand as if contemplating the demise of his people. So this is a great example of that stereotype of the doomed Indian. But how might Penn's Treaty and earlier references to Native women with babies imply not the extinction, but the growing population of Native people in the Americas? These images, after all, not only portray Native people as the first Americans, but also raising new generations of Americans. It doesn't show extinction, but growth and more generations to come. That West motherly figure wears more clothing than the naked woman of de Bry's print would have even evidenced the cultural evolution of Native people to Euro-American viewers. The mothering woman in West painting counters violent desires to vanish Native people from the continent and instead spoke alternatively to a future in which Native people would multiply and assimilate into settler society. But let me be clear that West also supports the idea that Native people were reluctant to or incapable of assimilation. His depiction of a Lenape mothering woman seated on the ground in the rugged wilderness portrays Native people as primitive. So does her cradleboard, which was viewed by some Euro-Americans as an ancient artifact of a prehistoric past. In contrast, other pictures by West show non-Native children curling in blankets or tenderly cuddling their mothers. The Native infant in Penn's Treaty, on the other hand, looks stiff and unmoving in the cradleboard, bound vertically by tight straps of cloth. The baby's lack of movement profoundly differs from West's depiction of his own child. This is Raphael, his son, who lovingly rubs his cheek against that of his mother and presses his body into her embrace. This would not be possible for a baby to dangle from its mother, like West's painting here. Instead, the baby in this instance is tightly pinned to the backboard. Europeans had long criticized cradleboards as strange, exotic, and evidence of a culture untouched by advanced civilization. Cradleboards and their representation in paintings like Penn's Treaty likely anchored Native peoples to a primitive past in the eyes of his viewers. Cradleboards are typically made for children under the age of 2 or to use until the infant is ready to crawl and walk. Infants are fastened to a flat wooden backboard padded with cushioning. On many cradleboards, there's a wooden visor attached to the top that protects the child's head if the cradleboard should collapse or fall forward. Beads, amulets, shells, they're also affixed to the visor, stimulating the child as would a mobile. One of the greatest benefits of the cradleboard is that it can be strapped to an adult while in transit, or propped up against an object to allow the caregiver freedom to move about without shouldering the child. Members of the Native American Heritage Program on Lenape culture explain that cradleboards are both decorative and protective. They are womb-like shelters that help transition babies between spiritual worlds. These carriers, which can take months to create and oftentimes by some of the most accomplished artists in the community, are passed down from generation to generation. Despite their cultural significance and savvy design, many members of the scientific community in the 19th century disparaged cradleboards. They claimed that their flat and hard design incited cranial dents and head and scalp injuries for native babies. Samuel Morton, father of craniology and author of the 1839 book Crania Americana, criticized the irregularity of native skulls that may have resulted from strapping a child to a cradleboard. His unfounded investigations, and let me also be clear, these are indeed unfounded, they resonate with phrenology and polygenism, 19th century philosophies that used cranial measurements to make racist conclusions that Native and African American people were less intelligent than and had different biological origins from white American races. Racist comments about cradleboards reveal how parenting traditions were wielded to support supremacist notions that Native Americans were an inferior people. In addition to scientists of the time, artist George Catlin also described head flatness among Native infants. Catlin, who's known for traveling and recording Native life in the plains, described what he called deficiencies that came from tightly bound cradle boards. In his treatise on the manners, customs, and conditions of the North American Indians, first published in 1841, which is what we see here, and one of the objects that I collected in a fellowship that I'm so grateful to have had at the library company in December. So they have so many unique resources, including this 1841 book, which Catlin shows a head flattening custom of the Chinook tribe in the Pacific Northwest. Though it's not the exact same thing as a cradle board, he describes how children's heads were flattened between two boards in a coffin-like cradle canoe for 5 to 8 weeks. Catlin provided an illustration of a head flattening board in his text, showing the results in a skull that is expanding at the sides and significantly wider in comparison to the narrow cavities of an unintentionally flattened skull. Although he doesn't find the effects to impact the intellect of the child, Catlin criticized this as one of the many, quote, ridiculous, cruel, and useless rituals of Native cultures that are buttressed by illogical superstitions, end quote. I think it's also noteworthy that Catlin includes skulls and boards in the same sketch as masks, mouth plugs, and war clubs. Catlin treated Native cultures like an anthropologist, as if he was documenting an exotic species soon vanishing. The artist's degrading description of head flattening traditions continued to present Native parenting traditions as evidence of an inferior race in need of rescuing. In contrast to Morton and Catlin, artist Alfred Jacob Miller did not draw attention to cranial dents in his depictions of cradleboards. Instead, he folded cradleboards into romanticized and classicized pictures of Native motherhood, similar to the earlier paintings of Benjamin West. Miller, he was a Baltimore artist known for his depictions of Native American people. He was commissioned by former British baronet William Drummond Stewart to document Native culture on an 1837 expedition through the Rocky Mountains to present-day Wyoming and Oregon. While these images from the 1830s served as personal mementos for Stewart, he actually reproduces them again for wider sale in the 1850s. Miller included cradleboards in nearly 20 paintings and in several versions of a Dakota woman like we see here sitting at the trunk of a tree. She's sweetly holding a baby upright in a cradleboard, and the figure makes eye contact with the viewer and presents the cradleboard as if on a stage. And I really always thought this image looked very staged and postured, as if she was putting this custom on display like an ethnographic curiosity. But this depiction also flaunts the convenience of a cradleboard, which safely props up the child. Ornaments dangle down from the visor that would have delighted the infant. Miller showed the sitter as another Native Madonna. Her hide and beaded fringe are combined with the red skirt and blue blanket, colors that share visual properties with Christianity's Mary. Alfred Jacob Miller gained a reputation as an American Raphael, a fitting comparison with this Renaissance artist, best known for Madonna and child paintings. By bracketing his native sitter in the visual language of Christian maternity, Miller once again frames native motherhood as a tender parenting practice. Miller's depictions of cradleboards also show this object in motion, displaying it as safe and resourceful. In paintings like this one, Miller shows a woman carrying a cradleboard with a concentrated focus on the ground as she fords a stream with an infant on her back. This is a cradleboard, by the way, not a papoose, which you see in the title here. He often erroneously called this a papoose in his titles. Papoose is an English butchering of what we think is originally an Algonquian term. But in this painting, one can still see the advantages of the cradleboard, which has an attached loop or fillet for the carrier to wear around their forehead. This would have provided additional buttressing for the infant while in transit. And in his writings, Miller complimented the device, saying, "These cradles are of the simplest construction, but could not be safer or more efficient without any amount of elaboration. 2 flaps of buckskin are fastened, one to each side of a board. The child is placed between them and they are laced over it. A strong guard protects the head and may be thrown down with violence without the slightest injury to the occupant. Being bound to these boards when young no doubt contributes in a marked degree to that straight, erect posture and carriage we notice in this people." So while there are some prejudices still inserted into this quote, contrary to scientific opinion, Miller praised the cradleboard as an efficient mechanism that diminishes the risk of injury and maintains the spinal dignity of its carrier. While a number of artists and scientists had described the cradleboard as an injurious device, Miller portrays it as a protective one, in spite of what he calls, a quote, simple construction. Miller's commentaries on cradleboards are an expansion of his opinions on Native mothers. He hoisted them up as protective caregivers and trailblazers of the Western frontier. He applauded Native women, writing that when a child is in danger, a Native mother will deliver a protective scream. Miller goes on to describe Native women as belonging to a hardy, healthy class. And alluding to the physical demands of motherhood, Miller's images align with other depictions of strong Native women, including the famous story of Lemhi Shoshone woman, Sacagawea. She's known for carrying her newborn son on a cradleboard in the face of many dangers along the expedition westward with Lewis and Clark. 19th century artworks continuously show Native women with determined expressions, scooping up an infant or dramatically bending forward by the weight of the cradleboard to signify their persistence amidst turmoil. And so I want more scholars to think about how we often think of a masculinized West that looms large in the US imagination, but Native women too were often depicted in art of the frontier. And more scholars need to study images of Native women and how the cradleboard was a frequent accessory in depictions showing Native women and the grit required to journey west. Despite the dignity that these depictions may show, they also omit the oppressive circumstances of westward expansion that required Native women to be strong and resilient in the first place. In numerous pictures, Miller showed Native women migrating, moving camp, and traversing the wilderness while supporting children on their backs. The artist evokes the conditions of migration that might not simply be seasonal, but forced as a result of settler infringement and government policies. In the very years that Miller first painted migratory women with cradleboards, President Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that mandated the removal of Native peoples from the Southeast onto reservations west of the Mississippi in a series of events known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Native people were dispossessed and displaced onto government-controlled reservations with little resources. Although Miller's subjects were located in the western corners of the country, a distance away from the people impacted most by the Trail of Tears, by the 1850s and 60s, when Miller returns to this subject matter again, he still omits the miserable conditions for many Native people in the plains and the far west who were now themselves forcibly displaced and especially vulnerable during the Civil War. His depictions of women with cradle boards, always in transit and temporarily stationed at a campsite, make the perpetual impermanence of Native people look picturesque. Miller's paintings of migrant Native Madonnas edit out the violence of forced removal and how Native people in the Western states were profoundly pressed to cede land. Now, despite the trauma of removal that might underline Miller's depictions, the cradleboard conveys the concepts of migration and mobility in generative ways for many Native American communities. The cradleboard embodies these concepts because its very function was migratory or transitory. Cradleboards are marked by a temporary 2-year time period before an infant matures into a walking, independently moving toddler. In this way, the cradleboard doesn't simply contain a baby's movements, but catalyzes it. In many California tribes, cradles are understood to move children through the journey of infancy and protect them by warding off danger. Cradleboards carry similar meanings in Anishinaabe cultures. In her article, From Great-Grandmothers to Great-Granddaughters, scholar Alexandra Nwegabo writes that cradleboards offer spiritual protection in Anishinaabe cultures. She says they provide safety for infants who are still strongly connected to and moving between the spirit world. Nwegabo squarely writes, cradleboards embody moving life. So in this case, cradleboards activate ideas about mobility in ways that extend far beyond the concept and context of forced removal. Yet, the cradleboard's intention to move children through the world has been arguably stalled and rendered motionless by their collection in US museums. This is where hundreds of cradleboards lay lifeless and go unused. And not fulfilling their original intention of cradling a child, cradleboards in museums can truly be painful reminders for Native viewers. Nwegabo writes, in many cases, cradleboards have been left in the dark, tucked away in the drawers of museum storage, lost and separated from their creators and their territory. Kiowa artist Terry Greaves also mourns how cradleboards at institutions like the Smithsonian are stacked together in locked cabinets in our nation's capital, so far away from home, so far away from the families they honored, so far away from the babies they once carried. For an object whose function is to mobilize infants, museums have been impeding the cradleboard's movement and preventing the return of these objects to the communities that use them. The cradleboard then illuminates once again how objects belonging to the culture of parenthood provoked weighty discussions about the futures of Native people in the United States. So now we're entering the last section of this talk, because nearly a century later in Idaho, artist Charles Knoll shows another image of a cradleboard and Native caretaking in a painting directly borrowed from Benjamin West. Knoll painted a treaty ceremony of the Shoshone people, ceding land to the US government during the Civil War era, which was one of the most dangerous time periods for Native people. Knoll's painting complicates West's glowing view of the treaty process by alluding to the ways in which Native people both welcomed and resisted it. In the middle ground, Knoll painted Governor Caleb Lyon and Minister Hiram Hamilton like Moses, parting the sea of Native people. They are supported by an army of soldiers, and I hope you can see these figures in the background, extending far into the horizon, displaying the manpower needed in a region where Native people were not surprisingly reluctant to relinquish land. Knoll shows US attempts to make the treaty more desirable by displaying piles of shiny gold pots, colorful beads, peacock feathers, and blankets all pooled together in the center. It seems intentional that Knoll displayed elements of Native resistance in his painting too. He depicts the Shoshone people on the sides of the painting, shifting around uncomfortably. Some figures stare directly at the viewer, unsmiling in ways that read as defiant and confrontational. Knoll captures the skepticism around this process in some of the figures' hostile expressions. Knoll's depiction of Native women in particular showed a rejection of US customs and intentions. While the artist subscribed to popular tropes of Native Madonnas, like we see here, embracing children on their laps, carrying children on cradle boards. His depiction of women and children also disturbed US standards of idealism. Unlike the controlled infant you might remember in West's painting, Knoll depicted fussy babies squirming and wriggling like animals that are similarly cradled, propped up, and tangled on the laps of the people in the painting. The woman cradling a baby on her lap was located in the same register of the painting as the person cradling, I think they're squirrels. I don't know if anyone has another interpretation, but it likens Native people to animals. The women would have also looked crude to 19th century viewers, for they wear little clothing and lack the classicized garments that evoked a Native Madonna. In Knoll's painting, where even Native women had not yet been Americanized and absorbed into the visual language of classical motherhood, this might have signaled to viewers that Native people could not and would not assimilate. Though some of the women in this painting also cradle babies in ways that mirror US expectations of femininity, in reality, the responsibilities of many Native women reached far beyond caregiving. Many Native communities were matrilineal societies where people of all genders collectively shared the responsibilities of parenthood. US ideas about a woman's role as the director of the home and family did not mesh with many Native societies where homes were organized by a complementary system of communal parenting. In some Northwestern and Plains tribes, women also played roles beyond caregiving by forming councils that actively determined trades and treaties. So for these reasons, Native women troubled US constructs of gender, making forced assimilation seem all the more challenging. By the end of the 19th century, the government installed an aggressive assimilationist policy with federal off-reservation boarding schools that forced Native people to integrate into US culture. The first school established by the government's Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1879 was the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. As part of the wider boarding school movement, first established in 1879, thousands of Native children as young as 7 years old were removed from their families and placed in institutions for 3 to 5 years. Teachers and administrators set out to assimilate Native children by prohibiting them from speaking Native languages, practicing ancestral traditions, and wearing Native clothing. Children were also given uniforms, haircuts, and Christian-inspired names intended to erase their Native identities. The mission of these schools was famously in the words of Captain Richard Henry Pratt to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man, end quote. Furthermore, students were given tasks divided by US gender roles. Girls, for instance, worked jobs relating to the kitchen, dining room, and laundry, and they were educated to become the mothers of tomorrow. For Native women, concepts of home and family life played a pivotal role in government policies to advance the subjugation of Native culture. This point, I argue, is evident in an 1884 cover of the popular magazine Frank Leslie's. It displays how boarding schools and their female graduates were thought to transform Native society. After finishing curricula at Carlisle Indian School, this image shows the aftermath of a Native woman returning home to her reservation. She stands out among Native people who wear chunky jewelry, headdresses, and cradle boards, all signifying an ancient culture. People ogle at her transformation into this Victorian model of womanhood. She wears a belted, European-style dress, a stylish hat, a parasol protecting her skin from the sun. And notice how the woman's skin is lighter than the people surrounding her, as if boarding school not only culturally, but physically whitened the student. While this print perpetuates stereotypes about Native people and also ignores the cruelties of boarding schools where many female students suffered abuses, this picture also destabilizes the school's mission by poking fun at the idea that these programs were so transformative that Native students returned home unrecognizable. This illustration asks viewers to evaluate the success of assimilation policies and whether graduates, specifically female ones, have been successfully converted. A decade later, into the 1890s, the US government created more assimilation programs targeting women. The Bureau of Indian Affairs installed a new division called the Field Matron Program. which sent women reformers to reservations to Americanize Native mothers. It instructed Native women on housekeeping tasks, such as learning how to clean pine floors, whitewash walls, and bake white bread. Lessons intended to whiten Native traditions in all ways. As in previous decades, cradle boards were again a point of contention for reformers who likened the objects to prisons. One reformer disparagingly described cradle boards as tightly bound containers inherited from a primitive pre-colonial past. Earlier in 1883, missionaries were advised to do whatever they could to, quote, get the babies off the board. That's what kills them, one person said. Through swapping out cradle boards with white American customs, field matrons were weaponizing motherhood and forcing Native women to assimilate. This is the last image I'll show you in my talk, because today a number of contemporary Native American artists, they're grappling with the US legacy of what's been called by scholars maternal colonialism. For instance, Louisiana Shoshone Bannock artist Jamie Okuma created an award-winning work in 2020, which shows a cradle board decorated with rebellious icons from popular culture. Okuma specifically displayed film character Gamera, this fire-breathing prehistoric turtle, an enemy to Godzilla. The inclusion of this turtle seems meaningful on a cradle board in North America, known by many Native communities as Turtle Island. Perhaps Gamera is a metaphor for Native people, whose breath of fire sarcastically sends the message, that's not Indian. In a long history of non-Native people claiming what is authentically Native or not Native, Okuma says this about her cradle board. This is us today. All these images have significant meaning for us. When I say us, I mean my family and I. Never do I speak for a group of people. We are not bound to anyone's idea of what Native art should look like. Okuma rejects non-Native designs to define Native culture, and she does so on a cradle board, the very object that a number of non-Native people criticized and tried to eradicate throughout US history. Hanging off the larger artwork is the sign, Baby on Board. So this is a reference to, you might remember, the bright yellow stickers, they're still popular, on car windows, but were first popular in the 1980s. These stickers encourage people to drive carefully around vehicles carrying children. This sign evokes caution and protection, similar to the larger purpose of the cradle board as this protective home for a child. And let me remind you that many critics since the 19th century denigrated cradle boards as injurious to children. Yet Okuma's board is decorated with the sticker, with spikes, a pantheon of other symbols that betray all of these criticisms. She shows the cradle board as a form of protection, but also survivance and the endurance of Native traditions despite attempts to suppress them. While Okuma's cradle board displays a Native future where children continue to be cradle boarded, her inclusion of a baby on board sign also speaks to the terrors of Native parenting in the US and a longer history of people policing ideas around Native motherhood. Thanks so much. I'll end my talk there. I really look forward to your feedback. As most research projects are, they're constantly in transition. So again, looking forward to some of your suggestions.
Well, thank you so much. I feel like I should provide at least a little bit of applause here. I know it's odd with the webinar format there.
Sure.
Everything's so kind of like quiet out there. So I want to give people a moment to digest like all of the amazing images and materials and this move through Indigenous history that we've just gone through. And I want to put a question out to you as well. And actually, first I should remind everyone, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A option down at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. So how does this fit into your bigger project? Because I know when you visited us a couple of months ago, you were looking at a variety of groups or motherhood among a variety of different groups of Americans. And so can you tell us a little bit more about how you feel or see this kind of fitting into a bigger project?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. It gives me an opportunity to talk about my second book project that I'm working on, which is called Spoiled Milk. And it's really looking at the racial politics of motherhood in this Victorian period, like the late 19th century. And as I was doing a lot of research on this topic, I just found so many terrifying similarities between the way Native motherhood is represented and Black motherhood in US art, as well as Eastern European immigrant mothers. Especially in the late 19th century, you see reformers also going into kind of like tenement housing, trying to change the way Eastern European mothers are mothering, telling them that they're not swaddling right, that they have to assimilate to US customs of the crib and the bassinet and all the things. And so, I stand on the shoulders of many scholars before me, but I still think that we need so much more attention on how motherhood is not just represented as this like sweet and tender construct, right? That it is really racialized and has also been politicized in ways that has been political, like used as this strategy to suppress other people. And so I haven't really figured out how the book project's going to shake out in terms of chapters, but I'm, definitely looking at representations of pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding as part of this larger idea of how motherhood is weaponized.
Right. It seems like in so many of these different groups, this is the idea of assimilation, like, and the idea of success to that assimilation is in some ways measured by a group of women's ability to then match the white middle class ideal that develops in
Yes.
the 19th century, as though that doesn't also have its own history that was developed in the early 19th century, right? That was not always the ideal to begin with. So,
Yeah, and Amy, what you're saying also reminds me that, there's a whole history of oppression for white American mothers as well, right? Like all the pressure on them to sustain these next generations of white races and to be these procreative mothers who are relegated to the home. Like no one's winning in this
right,
scenario.
right. And happy mothers who
Yes.
are natural, who pick up these activities naturally, despite the fact that there are a whole set of guidebooks that are produced for them to help them be able to reach that ideal.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, it seems like mothers from all different kind of sides are getting all kinds of different pressures. They might look slightly different, but are kind of coming from similar places in some ways.
Yeah, and I think also in some ways it's a lot easier to research the way that men impact politics and shape them, right? Because they're like the presidents or they're the strategists. But I think that a lot of people underestimate how impactful some of these reform movements were, and really seeking women as these entry points to transforming a culture.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you are speaking the language that cultural historians
Okay.
have been have been working with or working through for the past 10 or 20 years. That this is we know that women and their activities are super important. So how do we articulate that as historians beyond political speeches and what presidents have been
Yeah.
doing and things like that?
Yeah, and I
Um,
hope that also as an art historian, showing how all these images were so pervasive. Like these are some of the most famous paintings I'm showing. These are images from magazines that were widely circulating. I think also it's important to concentrate on how image makers were contributing to these movements, and that visually to see something can be really persuasive and really dangerous in a lot of ways. And so I think we also need more attention on the work that images are doing.
Absolutely. It was so interesting to see a number of these because I know in my survey classes, I use a number of those images pretty consistently.
Okay.
So these are things that are coming in front of history students on a pretty consistent basis. And
Yeah.
actually related to that, so thank you. We got a question from one of our audience members who says, amazing talk. So excited to hear more about this research. And she has a question specifically about West's painting. Do you think the nursing mother is in such a prominent position in that painting in order to show the Lenape as perhaps feminine and vulnerable to a colonial audience?
So this question comes from Laura Turner Igo, who's also written fantastic scholarship on the painting Penn's Treaty and is a local. She's a curator and I don't know her exact title at the Michener Museum, so everyone should go visit that museum as well, and a friend to the library company. That's a great question, Laura. I mean, I think that there's so much going on in that painting. Like, yes, she might be seen as this like coded feminine and vulnerable, but then also remember in the back of that painting, we see a kind of like a rugged masculinized idea of Native people who are like living in the wild and barely wearing any clothing and maybe don't seem so vulnerable. And so I think it's like constantly straddling this border of like showing them as assimilable, but not assimilating, and showing them as like being folded into culture and commerce, but also rejecting or enable to. And so, yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, though. Let me also just piggyback, and if you're available to talk back, that would be great, Laura. You know, she is located in such a prominent place. Like, why haven't scholars focused on her more? Because she is one of the first touch points that you kind of encounter, especially when you look at this painting in person, which is not too far away from the library company. It's at PAFA. And so I think her really prominent foregrounding really serves to just, like I said, sanitize the painting and make it seem so explicitly nonviolent.
Just looking at my options here to see.
Oh, I think she might be chiming in.
Oh,
I don't see her.
I clicked allow to
No
talk.
pressure.
See.
Oh, hey.
I know, no pressure.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
awesome. First of all, thank you, Shana, for that shout out. I didn't ask the question
Sure.
for that. I don't know. I mean, I've done some research on Penn's Treaty images and have not focused on that part of the painting. I know it's great that you are. I don't know if I have anything more profound to say, but I do. I just wrote in the Q&A. Like I also wonder about that thing is like bookended with these merchants that are sitting on the other side of the painting, and I've always found something interesting there. And also those masculine figures you talk about to me always seem like they're retreating into the forest, like they're willingly succeeding the land to Penn and his agents, like they're going to vanish back into that wilderness from which they came. But your reading of that is as that the Lenape and Native Americans are reproductive, so like a growing population is not something I had thought of before, and so I think that's really interesting, and that changes my perception of that work.
Wow. Yeah, thanks so much. That's really flattering. And you're right, like especially in the background, maybe the Native men look to be like cowering a little bit or hiding. And so also to be in direct contrast to the commerce on the left-hand side of the painting, there does seem to be a kind of opposition. But at the same time, that woman is decked out in European goods, it looks like. So it's like, again, that constant paradox where he's doing two things at the same time, which is kind of frustrating as a scholar, right? We want to be black and white about it, but it's not easy to do that with West. And then I'm also glad that you think my argument might be persuasive, right? That it's not all about the doomed and dying Indian, but that in constantly showing Native women breastfeeding, birthing, pregnant, like there's so much imagery of Native women and fertility that it doesn't imply extinction like we've been taught. Of course, that's very easy to see in a lot of paintings, but not all of them. And so I'm kind of thinking about this alternative.
No, that's great. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your entire project, Shana. This is wonderful.
Thanks, Laura.
I also wonder, you just said something about her connection with the consumer goods as well. And I wonder if there's something about the promise of Indigenous women as consumers of goods that also is part of that.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, you know, the desire to assimilate Native people is not, you know, just framed by like wanting to rescue them and like having these really prejudiced ideas about like bringing them over into progress and civilization, that it's to make money, it's to profit from them, right? And like showing women almost as these shoppers or like consumers engaged in fashions of the time period also, I think, speaks to how women were considered this entry point. Like they, in some ways, were more assimilable than men. And so if you can get to Native women first, then you have more success in like reaping the profits from them than going another route. That's, I think, like what some of the attitudes were from the time period were.
And perhaps shaping that next generation, right,
Yes.
with the children. I mean, the other thing that this really made me think about, I was so fascinated by your discussion and your point here that these cradle boards still exist as artifacts, and they're kind of inanimate, and
Yeah.
I wonder if you would argue, or if you would say that the archivists themselves or American archiving practices also intervene here and make them inanimate. And we have American archivists who have reinterpreted them or interpreted them to begin with. And so is this in part how visual culture is producing this depiction of Indigenous mothers and cradle boards, but also there's an aspect of the material, the preservation of the material culture that
Yeah.
almost is interacting in here too.
Yeah, like the afterlives of these cradle boards that are now, you know, pushed away in storage, or maybe they're on display in a museum. And so, you know, I don't know what audience members we have listening right now, but I have kind of a controversial perspective on it, as you can gather from my talk. Like, I think we just need to return them all, like repatriate everything. And so I think that some of the scholars I mentioned, you know, they have really painful encounters with these cradle boards, like they're not being used, that's what their intention was. Like, and
Right.
so it's painful to see them kind of cooped up in that way. And I think there are still ways that people who are not native can learn about cradle boards without having them be in storage or on display in a museum. And so, yeah, I would love to see more incentives on behalf of archivists and curators to maybe return these objects. And then I was also thinking, when I was doing this research, a lot of the images of cradle boards, including the one that I show, are kind of creepy. Like they don't have a baby in them. They just have this black abyss, like a black hole in the center of the cradle board. And so I also thought, like, how could even these images humanize them? And so I wondered, what if like we inserted a picture of a native baby in there? But that's like terrible in other ways. So
Right.
I don't think there's a winning solution here. But even the reproduction of the image of the cradle board on a website with an empty baby, like a cradle board empty of an infant, resembles the histories of Native people in this country and desires to exterminate Native culture.
Well, and you almost need two people there, right? Because in terms of
Yeah,
having this be something that moves children from kind of infancy to their toddler stage, like that this was both with that child in the cradle board, but also it attached to, or like interacting with the mother as well,
yeah.
right? So these are really meant to be active on multiple levels, and they're really being divorced from that kind of context in so many ways.
Yeah, I just wrote that down. That's such a great point. The idea of not just visualizing the baby, but the person carrying the baby. And again, that doesn't have to be like the stereotype of the feminine mother. Like caregiving was a responsibility among a lot of different people and still
Right.
is in all cultures. So yeah, the idea of like two people actually require representation.
Right. Because I think it seems a little humane just to say, like, well, this child was strapped to this board and it was just
Yeah,
somewhere, right? But I think you're part of what you were kind of getting at is that this was more of an interactive, this had a bigger context, right?
yes,
And there was a mother who was also there, or a caregiver in some kind of way, who
yeah,
was also interacting there. And that could just bring so much more context to understanding.
yeah, absolutely.
So. Well, I want to give us just another couple of seconds to see if anyone else in our audience has any questions, any other comments that they want to add before we wrap up this evening. Thanks to all of you for being here this evening after so much excitement
Yeah,
earlier
that's
today.
right.
As as well. I know it has been quite a historic day on multiple levels.
Yeah.
So I saw one last thing coming in. So Jessica is asking, I'm curious how Native women's breastfeeding might have been understood by the late 19th century at a time when medical professionals were increasingly diagnosing a host of problems around breastfeeding in non-Native women, and the first generation of quote unquote scientific formulas were emerging. Was there any discussion around Native women's breastfeeding? Any romanticization of nursing as a primitive format, but maybe also more natural?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And let me also shout out the person who's asking this question. Jess Dandona is, I think, maybe a former library company fellow, but has worked in the Philadelphia area and has terrific research on representations of breastfeeding in French and US culture. So definitely check out Jess's research. It's a great question because what you see is, like you intuited, a kind of romanticization around Native women breastfeeding and birthing, as if they're impervious to pain and are like able to sustain pregnancies better than like these hysterical white women. But you're also seeing in the late 19th century, the medicalization of childbirth and control, more and more control taken away from Native midwives and a Native, I'm forgetting the word, like not a shaman, like a kind of a medicine man, taking away control from them. And now these, more white male doctors are trying to colonize Native birthing rituals and trying to get them to give birth, to breastfeed more and more in hospitals. And so it's still this kind of colonization of motherhood, but at the same time, it is also leaning into and romanticizing Native women and some of their rituals like breastfeeding. It's a good question. I want to think more about it.
I think we have one last question possibly coming in from Allison herself.
Hi, yes. Thank you so
go.
much, Shana, for this talk. So many things that I'm going to be sitting with for a long time. And what I was wondering, and I couldn't concise myself enough to type it, is I was really struck by what you said about images of Native motherhood and fertility as sort of counter images to the idea of the doomed Native American. And I guess what I was wondering is maybe this is projecting modern prejudices onto the past, but I feel like there's so much modern hate mongering, fear mongering around like birth rates among communities of color and like the sort of like sexual practices that are judged or sort of invented from those ideas. And so I was curious if you feel like that might be present in here as well, and also whether you mentioned like the process of, or the preponderance of images of Native motherhood reflecting the idea that like the work of colonization was not done. How do you think the tone of that, like, do you think those painters were presenting like an optimistic view that there was more room to like spread things? Do you think it was a like, this is a fight that we're still fighting? I'm curious about those two things and how they connect.
Gosh, that is so brilliant. I wrote down a phrasing you said, like that I almost like these images show that the work of colonization isn't done yet. I think that's really striking and is a really persuasive interpretation of some of those images that show like Native women with, kids clinging to them and, hanging off their breasts, and like they're so fertile, they like procreate so easily, and that like, so many stereotypes from that time period about how Native people were polyamorous and, really far outside, a departure from like Christian norms. And so I think it's like doing all the work at the same time, right? It's showing Native people multiplying, that like they're not going away. It's showing them as fertile, as an extension of like this fertile, blessed landscape. It's showing that, oh gosh, like we gotta assimilate soon, like more and more Native people are coming. It's like doing everything at once in some ways. Like I don't think it's just doing one thing. But you know, there's a great book, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's something to the extent of like making Native people straight. Like that's the expression that was used, like to kind of constantly like classicizing or trying to put Native people into this Euro-American concept of a monogamous heteronormative relationship. And so I think it's doing that in a lot of those images, but in a way that's not benevolent, right? They're trying to profit off of the generations of Native people that are these images are promising. I don't know if that was any more articulate, but it gives me a lot to think about, especially that phrase that I wrote down that you said.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's super helpful.
Yeah.
We are just past 8 o'clock, so I'm going to do one last question here from the Q&A. And I think looking at the question of what images accompanied any early advertising or marketing, have you kind of looked beyond, I think, some of the paintings to other formats of visual culture where we might pick up some of these messages?
Yeah, I'm looking at everything. I'm looking at breast pumps. I'm looking at maternity wear. I'm looking at advertisements for pills and tonics. And actually a lot of those, the medicines in advertisements, some of them have like Native names, or they pretend to be like, this is a Cherokee medicine, and like really using like the stereotype of Native people as procreative to sell, you know, consumer goods and medicine to non-Native people. And yeah, Native people are everywhere in a lot of these advertisements. And so it definitely connects to the larger project. It's a great question.
Well, let's thank Dr. Klein once again for such a great, fascinating, like thought-provoking talk. And we're really excited to see where all of this goes down the line. So hopefully we'll be having you back in another couple of years to
Yes, I
talk
would love
about the
that.
finished project, right? That's the really exciting part about having our fellows on. They are like literally in the midst of doing this research right at this moment. So thanks to all of you as well, all of our attendees tonight. We really appreciate your time being here, and keep an eye out. Allison has dropped a number of links into the chat, and you should be getting your link to this talk again sometime down the line later this week. So thanks to all of you for being here, and have a really great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.